Whenever I do marriage preparation for a couple, be there the couple young or old, I always say to them very clearly, just so you know, your wedding day itself will not be perfect. Something will go wrong. Don't worry about it. It's fine. It's just part of the day. If nothing else, it will help to make that day a day to be remembered. And most often it is true. Weddings are an accident waiting to happen. You all know what I'm talking about. I'll never forget a true story that was told to me, actually to Adam and I, by a priest friend of ours. This was some 21 years ago when I was a newbie priest, and he told it by way of caution, and it is a true story. He says there was another priest who was well known for doing big weddings. He was in this beautiful big Gothic church and a great preacher to boot, and it was the kind of wedding where no expense had been spared, and there were hundreds of guests, and the lines of bridesmaids stretched, and the groomsmen went to eternity. But this is what happened. It just so happens that it had been a long week for that particular priest. Lots of other stuff was going on in the church, as it always does. And so that particular Saturday morning, when a buddy of his called and said, "Hey, what do you think? Let's do golf." And so, without thinking, he said yes. Now that was the day before cell phones. I don't know how or when the priest realized what had happened, but the wedding was scheduled for 1 p.m., and here he was, standing on the golf course, 1.5 hours away. Now, several people after the first service asked, "Well, then what happened?" I don't know. But it was bad. Something very wrong went on at the wedding in Cana of Galilee. In those days, the bride and the groom celebrated marriage not with a honeymoon, but by throwing a 7-day bash at the groom's home. And as we know, we heard, this particular celebration was also in trouble. You see, the wine had given out before the party was nearly over. This situation constitutes not just a little faux pas. Hospitality in the Middle East is a big deal. One writer suggests that when the party is cut short, it entails a social disaster, evoking strong, primal human emotions such as anxiety and deep shame. Now here's the deal. Jesus' mother notices the problem before her son does. Now, some scholars and mystics and monks throughout the ages have noticed this as well. Mary notices the problem before Jesus, the Son of God, notices the problem. I posed this problem to the Bible study this past week, and Janice's response was both spontaneous and perfect. "Duh," she said. "She's a woman and he's a man." I never thought of that. Here's what else goes wrong. Jesus' mother says to him, "The wine has run out." And Jesus' response is, "Not my problem, not my hour." You know, this is the same problem a lot of people have with prayer. How many times have you prayed, especially during times of extreme need, only finding yourself wondering, is God asleep on vacation, indisposed, perhaps just not interested in what is going on in my life. You know, there's a technical name for this problem. It's called theodicy. People cry out in times of war or persecution or environmental devastation or political trauma, and they think they hear God saying, not my problem, not my hour, but notice what Mary, the mother of Jesus, does. It is the most unusual, brave, cocky thing. She doesn't argue with him. She doesn't shame him. She doesn't do anything with him. She just looks at the servants and she says, do whatever he tells you. That's brilliant. Just speaking as a mother, perhaps Mary knows her son better than he knows himself. Isn't that somewhat a universal truth that we see our kids, our grandkids, sometimes better than they see themselves? We see not only their potential, but their giftedness, and we see their fear. Sure, it's hard for them to step onto the world stage, and sometimes, just sometimes, we push. Got some anxiety going on in your life this week? Not happy with the conditions happening in your family, your neighborhood, your classroom, or the world? Mary says to us across the centuries, do whatever Jesus tells you. This week, the poet, one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, died. You know, the way she lived and wrote reminds me a lot about Jesus. For instance, Mary wrote a lot of things about mortality, but with a spirit of gratitude and completion. In the poem, When Death Comes, she writes this: she hoped that at the end of her life, she would look back and see herself as a bride married to amazement. Wouldn't that be a wish for all of us? Mary says this in part of the poem. She says, when it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up having simply visited the world. In another poem, The Fourth Sign of Zodiac, it seems like the words she wrote could have been the words that Mary was thinking about her son, Jesus. And these are the words. She says, I know you never intended to be in the world, but you are in it all the same. So why not get started immediately? I mean, belong to it. There is much to admire, to weep over, and to write music or poems about. Bless the feet that take you to and fro. Bless the eyes and the listening ears. Bless the tongue, the marvel of taste. Bless touching. Do you need a prod? She says, do you need a little darkness to get you going? Let me be as urgent as a knife then. Do whatever he tells you, Mary says to the servants, and perhaps she is speaking to us. So what does Jesus do? He produces wine, a symbol of joy, and not just a little bit, but a lot. My sister, who is a little bit more of the Baptist leaning, corrected me this week, and she said, no, actually, it was grape juice. I don't think so. using the low estimate of 20 gallons per stone jar. That's 600 bottles each jar, or 3,600 bottles of wine, 300 cases in all. I don't think it was grape juice. And the best particular steward, he had the best wine that he had ever tasted. When it comes to bringing joy, Jesus can't help himself. This was the first sign of Jesus, according to the Gospel of John. And what's so interesting is Jesus does not do this to make a name for himself, but purely for the benefit of this loving couple that was about to be shamed. You know, this particular story is never remembered or recalled by the other gospel writers because he did it in a provincial town out of the way with no one but himself, his mother, a couple of servants, and perhaps the steward himself, noting the abundance and the quality. I read a story about a man who grew up years ago somewhere in rural America in the days before television, home entertainment, and he describes how his family, they would go to church on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday evening, and this man laments that the services were always somber, ponderous in the atmosphere, boring. And he grew up thinking that that was the way God wanted it, because that was the way God is. Ponderous, boring. Our gospel this morning makes it clear that God is not like that at all. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, Jesus sets the tone for his entire ministry. Throughout his ministry, he brings abundance. Jesus doesn't just talk about joy, he exhibits it. He evokes it. According to John's account, during the Last Supper with his disciples, on the threshold of suffering a horrible death, he peppers his final words to the disciples with words about joy, his joy, and their sharing in that joy. Now I'm going to have a challenge now, particularly to all the baby boomers. You remember Three Dog Night. The first verse captures the meaning of the gospel very well. It's all about a bullfrog, but it does say, I helped him drink the wine, and he's always made some mighty fine wine. This story, friends, is not about drunkenness. It's about joy, abundant joy. And I invite you now to join in with this joyful group. We might just go on and on, but let's hear it. I want the refrain that we're going to sing together. Do you need a reminder? Joy to the world, all you boys and girls. Joy to the fishes in the deep blue sea. Joy to you and me. May we, please. Amen.